March 1943. Smolensk, German-occupied Soviet territory. The basement safe house smelled of damp concrete and wood smoke from the inadequate heating stove, where Abwehrhauptmann Klaus Reinberger examined technical drawings that his network had obtained from a Soviet engineer recruited 6 months earlier at enormous risk. Drawings that showed a weapons system so sophisticated that Reinberger initially suspected they were deception planted by NKVD counterintelligence to waste German resources chasing phantom threats, drawings that depicted anti-tank mines with capabilities that seemed inconsistent with Soviet industrial limitations, and engineering competence as understood by German intelligence assessments that consistently rated Soviet technical capabilities as inferior to German standards. The drawings showed the TM-41 anti-tank mine, a new Soviet design that departed radically from conventional mine architecture, that used a tilt rod fuse mechanism triggered not by pressure, but by contact with any solid object, that activated when a tank's hull touched the vertical rod protruding above the mine body, rather than requiring the tank's weight to depress a pressure plate, that could be laid in much higher densities than pressure-activated mines because the tilt rod system required minimal spacing between mines, that created minefields so dense that German armor would encounter mines every few meters rather than the widely spaced obstacles that conventional minefields presented. Let's pause here for a moment. If you find value in stories like this, you can support the channel by liking the video and subscribing. After watching, leaving a brief comment, even a simple word, helps more than you might expect. Your support keeps these stories alive and visible. Thank you. Let's move on. Reinberger was 36 years old, an intelligence officer who had operated behind Soviet lines since the invasion began in 1941, who had built agent networks across occupied territories by recruiting Soviet citizens whose cooperation was motivated by ideology or coercion or simple desperation to survive in conditions where collaboration with German forces might be the difference between eating and starving. His network had provided valuable intelligence throughout 1942, had warned of Soviet counteroffensive preparations before Stalingrad, though those warnings had been dismissed by 6th Army Command as exaggerated pessimism from rear area analysts who didn't understand frontline realities, had identified locations of Soviet ammunition depots and fuel storage facilities that subsequent Luftwaffe attacks had destroyed, had established credibility that made Reinberger confident his current intelligence about Soviet mine technology was accurate rather than deception. The source was a Soviet engineer named Dmitry Volkov, who worked at a mine production facility near Tula, who had been recruited through combination of ideological appeal. Volkov apparently believed communist system had betrayed its revolutionary promises, and practical incentive in the form of gold coins and guarantees of safe passage to German lines if Soviet forces recaptured the region. Volkov had provided the TM-41 drawings, along with production data, showing that Soviet factories were manufacturing the mines at rate of approximately 50,000 per month, enough to create the dense minefields that the tilt rod design enabled, enough to potentially cover vast sectors of defensive fortifications with mine densities that would be nearly impassable for armored vehicles attempting to break through. The intelligence arrived in March 1943 as German forces were planning Operation Citadel, the massive offensive intended to destroy Soviet forces concentrated in the Kursk salient, the operation that would commit the Wehrmacht's strategic reserve of armor in a decisive battle that German commanders believed would restore initiative on the Eastern Front, and demonstrate that Stalingrad had been aberration rather than indication of shifting strategic balance. Citadel's success depended fundamentally on armored breakthrough, on German tanks penetrating Soviet defensive lines and reaching operational depth where panzer divisions could maneuver against Soviet rear areas and logistics, where the Wehrmacht's tactical superiority in mobile warfare would compensate for Soviet numerical advantages in static defense. But if Soviet defensive lines were protected by dense TM-41 minefields, if German armor encountered mines every few meters rather than at the widely spaced intervals that conventional pressure mines created, if the tilt rod fuses activated reliably and destroyed tanks faster than engineer units could clear paths, then the armored breakthrough that Citadel required might be impossible, might bog down in attritional fighting that consumed German armor without achieving the penetration that would make the offensive successful. Reinberger compiled his intelligence into a comprehensive assessment dated March 28, 1943, an assessment that described the TM-41's technical characteristics, that estimated Soviet mine production capacity, that calculated the potential densities of minefields defending the Kursk salient, that concluded with urgent recommendation that Operation Citadel be delayed until German forces could develop countermeasures to the tilt rod mine threat, that German armor doctrine be revised to account for defensive systems that exceeded previous Soviet capabilities, that intelligence estimates of Soviet technical competence be revised upward to reflect the sophisticated engineering evident in the TM-41 design. The assessment's conclusion was stark. Soviet anti-tank mine technology has advanced significantly beyond previous assessments. The TM-41 tilt rod mine represents sophisticated engineering that will create defensive obstacles far more effective than conventional minefields. Estimated mine densities in Kursk, salient defensive zones could reach 2,500 mines per kilometer of front, creating barrier that will significantly delay or prevent armored breakthrough. Recommend Operation Citadel be postponed until adequate countermeasures are developed. Current mine-clearing capabilities are insufficient for densities enabled by TM-41 design. Proceeding with Citadel under current conditions will result in unacceptable armor losses without achieving operational objectives. The assessment was transmitted through intelligence channels to Oberkommando des Heere, the German Army High Command, where it entered the bureaucratic processing system that filtered field intelligence through multiple analytical layers before reaching decision-makers, where each analytical layer applied institutional assumptions about Soviet capabilities that consistently downgraded threat assessments that suggested Soviet technical sophistication, where the comfortable certainty that German engineering was superior to Soviet engineering meant that reports suggesting otherwise were treated as anomalies requiring correction rather than as data requiring doctrine revision. The response came in late April, not from High Command directly, but from General Stab Intelligence Section, a response that dismissed Reinberger's assessment with language suggesting barely concealed contempt for Abwehr analysts who apparently didn't understand the fundamental reality that Soviet industrial capacity was adequate for mass production, but inadequate for sophisticated engineering, that the TM-41 design, if it existed at all, was probably crude improvisation rather than the sophisticated system that Reinberger's source material suggested, that German armor supported by adequate engineer clearing operations would overcome any minefield regardless of design sophistication or deployment density. The response memorandum stated, "Assessment of Soviet TM-41 mine is noted, but conclusions are inconsistent with established understanding of Soviet technical capabilities. Soviet industry excels at crude mass production, but lacks engineering sophistication evident in the described tilt rod mechanism. The drawings provided by Abwehr source may be aspirational designs rather than production systems. Even if TM-41 exists in limited numbers, Soviet production capacity is insufficient to create mine densities described in the assessment. German mine-clearing doctrine and equipment are adequate for any realistic minefield obstacle. Operation Citadel planning will proceed on current schedule. Abwehr is advised to focus intelligence collection on Soviet troop dispositions rather than on technical systems that likely represent Soviet propaganda intended to deter German offensive operations. Reinberger read this response in his Smolensk safehouse and felt rage so intense it made his hands shake. Rage at the institutional arrogance that dismissed field intelligence because it contradicted comfortable assumptions. Rage at the bureaucratic certainty that German capabilities were necessarily superior to Soviet capabilities, regardless of what evidence suggested. Rage at the knowledge that Operation Citadel would proceed into minefields that German commanders didn't believe could exist, that German armor would be destroyed by weapons that German intelligence had declared were propaganda fiction, that soldiers would die because generals preferred their assumptions to analysts' evidence. He attempted to escalate the issue through alternative channels, contacted colleagues in the Foreign Army's East Intelligence section that specialized in Soviet order of battle analysis, provided the technical drawings directly to officers who might have more credibility with operational commanders than an Abwehrhauptmann whose career had been spent in intelligence collection rather than in staff positions that granted institutional authority. The responses varied, but the conclusions were consistent. The TM-41 was interesting if real, but probably wasn't real in quantities that mattered. Soviet capabilities were being overestimated by analysts who saw sophisticated threats in what were actually crude improvisations. German armor would overcome any obstacles that Soviet forces could create, because German tactical doctrine and crew training and mechanical reliability were superior to Soviet equivalents. One particularly dismissive response came from Oberst Reinhard Gehlen, Chief of Foreign Armies East, who wrote, "The TM-41 mine, if it exists beyond prototype stage, represents marginal improvement over conventional Soviet mines. Soviet industry cannot produce sophisticated mechanisms in quantities necessary to create significant operational obstacles. Even dense minefields can be penetrated by proper combined arms tactics employing engineers, artillery preparation, and aggressive armor advance. Concerns about mine threats are overblown and reflect insufficient confidence in German tactical superiority. Our armor will break through Soviet defenses regardless of mine types, because our crews are better trained, our tanks are more reliable, and our doctrine is more flexible than Soviet rigid defensive schemes." This assessment from a senior intelligence officer with direct access to operational planning captured the institutional mindset that prevented German forces from taking the TM-41 threat seriously. The mindset that equated German technological and tactical superiority with invulnerability to Soviet innovations. The mindset that couldn't imagine Soviet engineering achieving results that German assumptions declared impossible. The mindset that would prove catastrophically wrong when Operation Citadel encountered exactly the defensive systems that Reinberger had warned about, and that German intelligence had dismissed as fiction or irrelevant. Operation Citadel began on July 5, 1943, massive armored assault involving nearly 3,000 tanks and assault guns supported by 2,000 aircraft, the largest German offensive operation since the invasion began. The operation that Hitler described as essential to restore German prestige after Stalingrad and to demonstrate that Wehrmacht retained offensive capability despite the strategic reverses of winter 1942 and 1943. The assault targeted the Kursk salient from north and south simultaneously, intended to encircle and destroy the Soviet forces concentrated in the Bulge, intended to achieve decisive victory that would stabilize the Eastern Front and provide breathing space for Germany to consolidate its position. The northern assault, spearheaded by Ninth Army under General Model, encountered Soviet defensive lines protected by exactly the dense TM-41 minefields that Reinberger had warned about, and that German intelligence had dismissed as impossible or irrelevant. The minefields began appearing at 0600 hours on July 5th, as lead German armor advanced across no man's land toward Soviet positions, appeared as mines detonating under tanks that had traveled only a few hundred meters from the start line, appeared as explosions that destroyed tracks and suspension systems, and immobilized vehicles that then became targets for Soviet anti-tank guns firing from prepared positions. The density was extraordinary, exactly as Reinberger's assessment had calculated. Mines encountered every 5 to 10 meters, rather than at the 30 to 50 meter spacing that conventional pressure mines required, meaning that German tanks advancing in line formation would have multiple vehicles hit mines simultaneously rather than just the lead tank triggering an obstacle that following tanks could avoid. The tilt rod fuses activated with devastating reliability, requiring only light contact to trigger detonation, meaning that tanks couldn't avoid activation by careful driving because the tall grass concealed the rods until the moment when tank hulls brushed against them and initiated explosions that the tank commanders hadn't anticipated because their briefings had assured them that Soviet mines were crude pressure devices that could be avoided through proper movement techniques. The German engineer units assigned to clear paths through the minefields discovered that their doctrine and equipment were inadequate for the densities and fuse mechanisms they encountered, discovered that mine rollers and explosive line charges that worked effectively against conventional minefields were overwhelmed by TM41 densities that required clearing hundreds of mines per kilometer rather than dozens, discovered that manual probing and clearing was impossibly slow under Soviet artillery fire that targeted engineer teams working in no man's land, discovered that Soviet defensive planning had created obstacle systems that German doctrine hadn't prepared for, and that German intelligence had assured commanders wouldn't exist in operationally significant quantities. By 1200 hours on July 5th, the northern assault had advanced less than 6 kilometers against Soviet defenses, had lost approximately 200 tanks to mine strikes, had bogged down in attritional fighting where armor couldn't maneuver because minefields channeled movement into kill zones covered by anti-tank weapons, where the mobile warfare that German tactical doctrine emphasized was impossible because the terrain was too heavily mined to permit off-road movement. General Model reported to Klug at Army Group Center headquarters that progress was significantly slower than planned, that mine obstacles were more extensive than intelligence had indicated, that continuing the assault would consume armor at unsustainable rates without achieving the breakthrough that Citadel required. The southern assault under General Hoth encountered similar conditions: dense TM41 minefields that destroyed tanks faster than engineers could clear paths, Soviet defensive depth that meant penetrating one minefield simply led to encountering another behind it, artillery fire that made mine clearing operations nearly impossible, a defensive system so comprehensive that German armor's technical superiority and crew training advantages couldn't overcome the physical obstacle of having to stop every few meters to clear mines while under fire from positions that Soviet forces had months to prepare. By July 10th, Operation Citadel had effectively failed, had achieved penetrations of only 15 kilometers in the north and 30 kilometers in the south, had consumed nearly 800 tanks without reaching operational depth where maneuver could occur, had demonstrated that German armor couldn't simply overwhelm Soviet defenses through aggressive tactics when those defenses included obstacle systems that German intelligence had dismissed as impossible. Hitler suspended the offensive on July 13th, recognized that continuing would waste the strategic reserve without achieving decisive results, acknowledged that the offensive had failed to restore German initiative, and had instead validated Soviet defensive capabilities. The daily combat reports from formations engaged at Kursk told the story of an offensive grinding to halt against obstacles that shouldn't have existed in such density, told the story through casualty figures that mounted without corresponding territorial gains. On July 6th, the second day of operations, 9th Army reported 89 tanks destroyed by mines, 156 damaged requiring recovery and repair, progress of only 4 kilometers against objectives that were supposed to be reached on the first day. On July 7th, the reports noted that engineer units were exhausted from continuous mine-clearing operations under artillery fire, that tank companies were down to 40% strength from mine strikes, that Soviet defensive fire from prepared positions was inflicting casualties that couldn't be sustained at current rates. By July 8th, some German divisions were effectively combat ineffective, despite having been at full strength 3 days earlier. The 18th Panzer Division reporting only 23 operational tanks remaining from its initial complement of 98. The 20th Panzer Division reporting that its engineer battalion had suffered 60% casualties attempting to clear paths through minefields whose density exceeded anything the battalion's training or equipment could handle effectively. The division commanders were requesting immediate reinforcement or permission to break off attacks that were consuming their units without achieving breakthroughs. Model's reports to Army Group Center became increasingly pessimistic as the northern assault stalled completely, as it became clear that penetrating the first Soviet defensive belt had simply led to encountering a second belt behind it with equally dense minefields and equally well-prepared firing positions. As the realization set in that Soviet defensive planning had created systems with sufficient depth that German armor couldn't break through before exhausting its strength. Model's July 9th report stated, "Continuation of offensive operations will result in complete destruction of committed forces without achieving operational objectives. Soviet defenses are more extensive than intelligence indicated. Mine obstacles are preventing maneuver warfare. Request permission to transition to defensive operations before remaining armor strength is completely depleted." This request to suspend operations after only 4 days of fighting represented admission that Citadel had failed, that the confident predictions of breakthrough had been wrong, that the obstacles German intelligence had dismissed as manageable were actually insurmountable given available resources and tactics. The request was denied initially. Hitler insisted the offensive continue because admitting failure would damage German prestige. But by July 12th, even Hitler recognized that continuing was pointless wastage of the strategic reserve that would be needed for defensive operations as Soviet counteroffensives developed along other sectors of the front. The southern assault under Hoth fared marginally better, achieving deeper penetrations toward Prokhorovka, where on July 12th the largest tank battle of the war occurred, where approximately 800 German tanks engaged approximately 850 Soviet tanks in confused melee that resulted in enormous casualties on both sides, but which failed to achieve the breakthrough that would have made the casualties worthwhile, that demonstrated Soviet willingness to accept losses that German forces couldn't sustain, that showed that even when German armor reached open terrain where maneuver was possible, Soviet operational reserves were sufficient to contest that terrain and prevent exploitation. The battle at Prokhorovka became legendary in Soviet historiography as example of heroic resistance, became controversial in German accounts as example of tactical victory. German forces held the field and destroyed more Soviet tanks than they lost. That was strategic defeat, because holding the battlefield didn't achieve the operational objective of breaking through to Soviet rear areas, didn't prevent Soviet reserves from containing the penetration, didn't change the reality that Citadel had consumed German strategic reserve without accomplishing its mission. The after-action analysis conducted by Wehrmacht intelligence officers examining Citadel's failure identified mine obstacles as primary factor preventing breakthrough, identified the TM-41 as significantly more effective than pre-operation assessments had predicted, identified the intelligence failure that had caused German commanders to underestimate Soviet defensive preparations. The analysis noted that field intelligence from Abwehr sources in March had warned about TM-41 capabilities, but that this intelligence had been dismissed by senior analysts who believed Soviet technical capabilities were insufficient to create the obstacle systems that ultimately proved decisive. One particularly damning passage in the analysis stated, "Pre-operation intelligence assessments underestimated Soviet mine capabilities. Field reports warning of sophisticated tilt-rod mine systems were dismissed as exaggerated or unreliable. The TM-41 mine proved far more effective than anticipated, creating obstacles that significantly delayed armored advance and contributed to operation failure. Previous assumptions about Soviet technical inferiority prevented proper threat assessment. Future operations must account for possibility that Soviet engineering capabilities exceed our current estimates. The detailed tactical analysis revealed the extent of mine-related losses, documented that of the 788 German tanks and assault guns destroyed or severely damaged during Citadel, approximately 394, fully half, were disabled by mine strikes rather than by Soviet anti-tank fire or tank versus tank combat. This ratio shocked the analysts who compiled the data because it indicated that obstacles had been more lethal than enemy fire, that static defensive systems had defeated mobile offensive systems, that the Wehrmacht's tactical superiority in maneuver warfare had been negated by defensive engineering that prevented maneuver from occurring in the first place. The mine casualty data was broken down by sector and by day, revealing patterns that demonstrated Soviet defensive planning sophistication. The highest mine casualty rates occurred in the first 48 hours of the offensive, when German formations were concentrated and moving through predictable avenues of approach, suggesting Soviet engineers had correctly anticipated German attack axes and had placed maximum mine densities in those areas. As German forces attempted to maneuver around heavily mined sectors, they encountered secondary minefields that indicated Soviet planners had anticipated flanking movements and had prepared defenses in depth. The analysis noted that German mine-clearing operations had proven fundamentally inadequate for the scale of obstacles encountered. Standard mine-clearing techniques, engineer teams with mine detectors working ahead of armor columns, could clear perhaps 50 meters of path per hour under ideal conditions, perhaps 20 meters per hour under fire. With TM41 densities reaching 250 mines per kilometer in some sectors, clearing a single kilometer required finding and neutralizing 250 mines, requiring 125 hours of work if done systematically. No offensive operation could sustain forward momentum while waiting 5 days to clear each kilometer of advance. Alternative mine clearing methods, explosive line charges that cleared wider paths in single detonations, mine roller attachments that detonated mines ahead of tanks, specialized mine-clearing tanks that used flails to beat the ground, all proved less effective than doctrine predicted because TM41 tilt rod fuses sometimes failed to detonate from explosive overpressure or from flail strikes, requiring multiple passes or backup manual clearing that consumed time that tactical operations couldn't afford. This analysis, written with the careful language of staff officers who needed to acknowledge failure without directly blaming the senior commanders who had ignored warnings, captured the essential dynamic that had made Citadel's failure predictable to anyone who had taken Rheinberger's March intelligence seriously. The dynamic where institutional assumptions about Soviet inferiority had prevented realistic threat assessment, where comfortable certainty that German capabilities were superior had made commanders unable to imagine that Soviet engineering could create obstacles that German doctrine couldn't overcome. Rheinberger received a copy of the after-action analysis in August 1943, read it in his Smolensk safe house, while Soviet partisan activity was making his intelligence network increasingly difficult to maintain as German occupation authority collapsed across the rear areas, read the acknowledgement that his March warning had been correct, while hundreds of German tank crews had died because his warning had been ignored. He felt no vindication, only exhausted anger at the waste, at the preventable casualties, at the strategic failure that might have been avoided if someone with authority had listened to someone with evidence. In September 1943, Rheinberger was reassigned to a staff position in Berlin where his expertise in Soviet technical capabilities was supposedly valued more than it had been by operational commanders, where he could contribute to revised intelligence assessments that acknowledged Soviet capabilities rather than dismissing them based on assumptions about Slavic inferiority and communist industrial inadequacy. The reassignment was presented as promotion, but felt like exile from the actual intelligence work that Reinberger valued, felt like bureaucratic effort to contain an officer whose accuracy had been embarrassing to senior analysts who had been wrong. His final report from Smolensk operations, submitted as part of his reassignment paperwork, included an assessment of what had gone wrong with Citadel intelligence, an assessment that was more direct than the official after-action analysis had been. Operation Citadel failed because German intelligence dismissed evidence that contradicted comfortable assumptions about Soviet capabilities. Field intelligence warning of sophisticated mine systems was available 3 months before the operation began. This intelligence was ignored because it suggested Soviet engineering had achieved results that German doctrine assumed were impossible for Soviet industry to produce. The failure was not lack of intelligence, but rejection of intelligence that challenged institutional beliefs about German superiority and Soviet inferiority. This assessment was noted in his personnel file, but apparently not circulated to the commanders who would plan subsequent operations, apparently considered too critical of institutional decision-making to be useful for organizational learning, apparently filed away as the opinion of a field intelligence officer whose perspective was valuable, but whose conclusions about systemic problems were uncomfortable enough to be quietly ignored by the same institutional structures that had ignored his warnings about the TM-41 in the first place. Soviet forces captured German Citadel planning documents during their counteroffensive in summer 1943, documents that included the dismissed intelligence assessments about TM-41 capabilities, documents that Soviet intelligence analysts studied with interest because they revealed that German commanders had received accurate warning about Soviet mine defenses, but had chosen not to believe the warnings. Soviet assessment of these captured documents noted, German intelligence collected accurate information about our defensive preparations, including mine deployment densities and TM-41 technical characteristics. German commanders dismissed this intelligence as unreliable or exaggerated. Their failure to act on accurate intelligence contributed to Operation Citadel's defeat. This demonstrates that even effective intelligence collection is worthless if commanders refuse to believe information that contradicts their assumptions. This Soviet analysis, conducted by officers who had no personal stake in German institutional politics, but who had professional interest in understanding enemy decision-making, captured external perspective on the intelligence failure that had helped defeat Citadel. The failure that wasn't about collecting information, but about whether collected information was believed and acted upon. The failure that reflected institutional culture more than analytical capability. The failure that was about arrogance and assumption, rather than about data quality or source reliability. German commanders interviewed after the war acknowledged that Citadel had been defeated primarily by Soviet defensive preparations, that German intelligence had underestimated, acknowledged that mine obstacles had been more extensive and more sophisticated than pre-operation assessments had predicted, acknowledged that German armor doctrine had proven inadequate against defensive systems that Soviet forces had time to prepare. But few acknowledged explicitly that the intelligence about TM-41 capabilities had been available months before the operation and had been dismissed because it contradicted assumptions about Soviet technical inferiority. General Feldmarschall Erich von Manstein, commanding Army Group South during Citadel, wrote in his post-war memoirs, "The operation encountered obstacles that intelligence had not adequately warned us about. The Soviet mine defenses were far more sophisticated than we expected. Their mine densities exceeded anything we had encountered previously. Our clearing operations proved inadequate. These factors contributed significantly to the operation's failure to achieve breakthrough." This account, written decades after the event with the benefit of hindsight but apparently without access to or memory of Reinberger's March intelligence report, represented the sanitized version of events that blamed intelligence failure rather than acknowledging that intelligence had existed but had been rejected. Manstein didn't mention that warnings about sophisticated mine systems had been available, didn't acknowledge that his own intelligence staff had dismissed those warnings as inconsistent with understanding of Soviet capabilities, didn't accept responsibility for proceeding with an operation whose success depended on breakthrough that couldn't occur if the warnings were accurate. General Heinz Guderian, who as Inspector General of Panzer Troops had reviewed Citadel planning, was more direct in his post-war assessment. We underestimated Soviet defensive capabilities. We assumed that German tactical superiority would overcome any obstacles. We were wrong. The Soviets had learned from previous battles and had created defensive systems that our doctrine couldn't penetrate quickly enough. We should have paid more attention to intelligence about their preparations, instead of assuming that Soviet capabilities were necessarily inferior to ours. This assessment, while still not explicitly mentioning Rheinberger's intelligence, at least acknowledged the fundamental error of assuming Soviet inferiority, rather than treating Soviet forces as competent enemies capable of effective defensive engineering. Guderian's recognition that assumption had trumped evidence represented partial understanding of what had gone wrong, though even this more honest assessment avoided the uncomfortable reality that specific warnings had been dismissed by specific commanders whose names were attached to specific decisions that proved disastrously wrong. The TM-41 mine itself became object of German technical study after Citadel, as Wehrmacht engineers examined captured specimens and attempted to understand why the design was so effective and why German intelligence had underestimated it. The technical analysis revealed that the mine was indeed sophisticated, that the tilt rod fuse mechanism was reliable and difficult to defeat, that the design allowed the density of deployment that had proved so effective at stopping German armor. The analysis noted that Soviet engineers had solved technical problems that German engineers had assumed would be too difficult for Soviet industrial capacity, that the assumption of Soviet technical inferiority had been wrong in this case, and might be wrong in other areas as well. One German engineering report stated, "The Soviet TM-41 represents competent engineering solution to anti-tank defense requirements. The tilt rod fuse is reliable and triggers with minimal contact force. The mine body is robust and weather-resistant. The design allows high-density deployment that creates effective obstacles. Soviet engineers demonstrated technical capability that exceeds our previous assessments. Future planning must account for possibility that Soviet weapons development is more sophisticated than our assumptions indicate." This technical assessment, written by engineers examining hardware rather than by intelligence analysts examining assumptions, represented clearer recognition that German superiority was assumption rather than fact, that Soviet engineering could produce effective weapons, that the cultural arrogance embedded in German military thinking had created blind spots that cost lives and lost battles when reality contradicted comfortable certainties. Rheinberger remained in Berlin through 1944 and into 1945 as the war turned decisively against Germany, as Soviet forces advanced toward Berlin, as the intelligence work that had been his career became increasingly pointless because Germany lacked the military strength to act on intelligence, regardless of its accuracy. He survived the war, surrendered to American forces in May 1945, provided extensive debriefing about his intelligence operations and about the institutional failures he had observed. In a 1946 interview with American intelligence officers compiling lessons learned from German intelligence operations, Rheinberger described the TM-41 case and the broader pattern it represented. "I provided accurate intelligence about Soviet capabilities months before it mattered. The intelligence was dismissed because it contradicted assumptions about Soviet inferiority. This pattern repeated throughout the war. Field intelligence suggesting Soviet competence was discounted by senior officers who couldn't imagine that Soviets could match German capabilities. The institutional assumption of racial and cultural superiority prevented realistic threat assessment. We lost battles not because we lacked intelligence, but because we refused to believe intelligence that challenged our comfortable certainties about our superiority. The American officers conducting the interview noted this assessment in their report, included it in the compilation of German intelligence lessons that was supposedly intended to help American forces avoid similar mistakes, though whether American institutional culture would actually learn from German experience was questionable, given that American forces had their own assumptions about superiority and their own tendencies to dismiss enemy capabilities that seemed inconsistent with those assumptions. The legacy of the TM-41 intelligence failure at Kursk extended beyond the immediate operational defeat, shaped Soviet confidence that German forces could be stopped through proper defensive preparation, validated Soviet defensive doctrine emphasizing depth and obstacles, demonstrated that German armor wasn't invincible when confronted with well-prepared defenses that German doctrine hadn't trained for. The strategic impact was that Kursk marked the last major German offensive on the Eastern Front, marked the definitive shift to strategic defense that would last until Germany's final collapse, marked the moment when Soviet forces seized initiative that they would never relinquish. Whether this outcome would have been different if German commanders had believed Rheinberger's March intelligence, if Citadel planning had accounted for dense TM-41 minefields, if engineer preparations had been adequate for the obstacles they would actually encounter, remains counterfactual speculation. But the certainty is that accurate intelligence existed, that German forces had warning about Soviet defensive capabilities, that commanders chose not to believe the warning because it contradicted assumptions about Soviet inferiority, that this choice contributed to operational failure that cost 800 tanks and marked strategic turning point. The intelligence failure wasn't about collection. Rheinberger's network had obtained accurate technical data and production estimates months before they mattered. The failure was about institutional culture that valued assumptions over evidence, that treated warnings challenging comfortable certainties as anomalies to be dismissed rather than as data requiring doctrine revision, that equated national and racial superiority with technical superiority, regardless of what actual examination of enemy systems revealed. This failure pattern, dismissing intelligence because it contradicts assumptions, underestimating enemies based on cultural stereotypes, proceeding with operations despite warnings that contradict optimistic planning, was not unique to German forces at Kursk, but represented recurring pathology in military organizations that value confidence over accuracy, that punish pessimistic assessments more severely than they punish optimistic assessments that prove wrong, that create incentive structures where telling commanders what they want to hear is rewarded, while telling them uncomfortable truths is career-limiting. Rheinberger understood this after Kursk in ways he hadn't before, understood that providing accurate intelligence was insufficient if institutional culture prevented that intelligence from being believed and acted upon, understood that the intelligence failure at Kursk was systemic rather than individual, understood that fixing it would require changing assumptions and culture rather than just improving collection capabilities. But changing institutional culture is far more difficult than collecting intelligence, requires admitting that comfortable assumptions were wrong and that enemies are competent, requires accepting that superiority is earned through performance rather than assumed through heritage, requires humility that military organizations rarely possess until catastrophic failure forces it upon them. The TM-41 mine, that German intelligence dismissed as impossible or irrelevant, helped destroy Operation Citadel, helped defeat the last German offensive on the Eastern Front, helped demonstrate that Soviet engineering was competent and Soviet defensive preparations were effective, and German assumptions about superiority were dangerously wrong. The mine itself was just hardware, clever but not miraculous, effective but not unbeatable. What made it decisive was that German commanders didn't believe it existed in quantities that mattered until their tanks started exploding in dense minefields that intelligence had warned about, and that institutional arrogance had dismissed. That was the trick that German arrogance ignored, the Soviet secret that German intelligence collected but German commanders refused to believe, the warning that came 3 months early but arrived 3 months too late, because the time between collection and belief was consumed by institutional resistance to information that challenged comfortable assumptions about German superiority and Soviet inferiority. The spy did his job. The intelligence was accurate, the warning was timely. The failure was that no one with authority was willing to believe that Soviet engineers could build what German assumptions said they couldn't build, that Soviet defenses could stop what German doctrine said couldn't be stopped, that the comfortable certainty of superiority was wrong, and the uncomfortable warning from a Hauptmann in Smolensk was right.